J.M. Coetzee's Foe, A Postmodern Dichotomy by Clea Tazaka. Written as a satirical reinvention of Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, J.M. Coetzee's novel Foe uses minimal plot to limit the reader's view and hone in on the psychology of the characters. Using his characters as a metaphor, Coetzee sheds light on the realities of colonialism hidden behind the British grand narrative. Born in Cape Town, South Africa, J.M. Coetzee grew up during the apartheid period, an era infamously known for racial segregation and public uprisings in South Africa. Despite the common expectation to write about social and political unrest caused by the turbulence in South Africa, Coetzee moved away from that narrative. In his novel Foe, Coetzee strays far from the South African apartheid narrative and into the 17th century in England. His novel follows a woman named Susan Barton, who embarks on a trip to go find her daughter in Brazil and instead, unfortunately, gets caught in a shipwreck and eventually becomes stranded on an island. Once she reaches an island, a slave without a tongue saves her and brings her to his slave owner, her friend Crusoe. On the island, Susan Barton becomes close to Crusoe and tries to talk to him about his story and his narrative. She finds that Crusoe is uninterested in writing his story or even leaving the island, and she believes that he's lost hope in salvation. However, eventually, they become saved, but Crusoe dies on his journey back to England, while Susan and Friday make it back home. Once they're home, Susan embarks on a journey to try and have her story written. She reaches out to Foe, a writer in England. Coetzee's Foe has been categorized as a postmodern novel. But what in fact is postmodernism? Postmodernism can be defined as the literary move away from traditional narrative and representation. The nature of a postmodern novel is metaphorical, allowing the writer to make a social or political point without explicitly saying so. In Foe, Coetzee moves away from the British grand narrative, using Susan's nationalism to satirize English self-conceptions of being great civilizers. Susan Barton struggles to tell her story of the island and consistently writes to Foe, even during times where she knew her letters would never reach him. Susan fails to appeal to the English taste. Her story lacks grandiose adventure and conquest. As seen in this quote, Foe is talking to Susan about her story through letters. He writes her back saying, "Yet, I would pursue. If we were near the heavens there, why was it that so little of the island could be called extraordinary? Why were there no strange fruits, no serpents, no lions? Why did the cannibals never come? What will we tell folk in England when they ask to divert them?" He doubts Susan's story here and believes that it wouldn't appeal to most Englishmen. Although Susan's narrative consists of her journey to get back to England, publish her book about Crusoe's Island, and help Friday get back to Africa, she realizes that her ambitions are naive. During a conversation between Susan and two shipmen, She begins to talk to them about Africa and how she desires to have Friday go back home because he may very well be happier at home. The shipman eventually replied to her and say, "Very well," pocketing a paper. "We will put your man ashore wherever in Africa he instructs us. But now you must say your farewells. We sail in the morning." Susan begins to think after. Internally she says, "Whether it was the captain's manner, or whether the glance I caught passing between him and the mate, I cannot say, but suddenly I knew all was not as it seemed to be." "The paper is Friday's," I said, holding out my hand to receive it. "It's his only proof that he's a free man." And when the captain had returned the paper to me, I added, "Friday cannot come aboard now, for he has belongings to fetch from our rooms." As a postmodern writer, Coetzee used metafictionality, a type of writing which worked against the expectations for writers to write about political and social issues of their time. Coetzee uses this form of metaphorical writing, instead, to satirize the English idealism about colonization. Using metafictionality and the conflict in representation that Susan faces psychologically, Coetzee exposes certain dichotomies of his era. Through Susan's quest to civilize Friday and make him happy, Coetzee shows the true British mentality on colonialism and ideas of civility. As seen in the way that Susan tries to teach Friday how to talk, we see that she's naive and still holds that British idea that they can civilize any savage. On page 148, she says, "I drew a ship in full sail and made him write ship, and then began to teach him Africa. Africa I represented as a row of palm trees with a lion roaming among them. Was my Africa the Africa whose memory Friday bore within him? I doubted it. Nevertheless, I wrote Africa and guided him in forming the letters." Through Susan's psyche, Coetzee exposed what the English grand narrative was internalized to be. England's grand narrative, and what the English believed made them great, was actually what degraded others. And slowly, he exposes this through Susan. Because of Susan's English ideals, her need to reintegrate Crusoe into English life is what caused him to die as they sailed back to England. Her obsession to tell her story and become famous among the English turned her into something the English would despise, as seen when she speaks to an innkeeper. As seen on page 104, she says, "I asked civility for 2 measures of small beer and a plate of bread and cheese. He made no reply, but stared pointedly at Friday and then at me. 'This is my manservant,' I said. 'He's clean as you or I.' 'Clean or dirty, he wears shoes in this house,' he replied. 'If you will tend to serving us, I will tend to my servant's dress,' I said. 'This is a clean house. We do not serve strollers or gypsies,' said the innkeeper, and turned his back on us." Even in Susan's attempt to free Friday, she realizes sending him to Africa would only result in him being resold into slavery. As she forced her ideals of happiness onto Friday, she made him feel even more trapped and unhappy than he ever was. This was all because Susan held on to the English ideal that the British know best. Throughout Foe, Coetzee says one thing, but means another, as seen through Susan's psychological conflict. In postmodern fashion, Coetzee doesn't offer any resolution to his novel, mimicking the complexities of British colonialism. By minimalizing his plot and focusing on Susan's internal voice, he satirizes English mentality. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed my video.